Imagine, just for a second, that the only way to prevent World War III is for Europe to completely sever its military ties with the United States.
Which, I mean, sounds completely crazy, right?
Just totally walk away from NATO. Entirely.
It sounds like geopolitical treason, honestly. It completely violates the foundational logic of the whole post-war world.
It really does. It feels like telling someone, the best way to survive a hurricane is to intentionally tear the roof off your own house.
Yeah, exactly.
But today, we are doing a deep dive into this terrifying, brilliant, and honestly deeply controversial roadmap by international politics professor Koert Debeuf.
And this is based on a really in-depth Dutch interview transcript we have of his work.
Right. And he basically argues that our 20th century obsession with massive alliances and, infinite military buildups is exactly what's pushing us toward the brink.
Yeah, it's a total paradigm shift.
It really is. So we are going to connect the dots today, from decapitation strikes in the Middle East to the rigid railway timetables that caused World War I, right down to the actual neurobiology of the algorithm currently dictating your social media feed.
And before we really get into the mechanics of this, let's just establish the analytical lens we are using for this deep dive today.
Oh, for sure. That's super important.
Because Debeuf's thesis touches the third rail of global politics. I mean, we are going to be dissecting the strategies of figures like Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, the theological leadership in Iran, and these surging nationalist movements across Europe.
Very charged stuff.
Highly charged. So our role here is strictly to map the architecture of Debeuf's argument. We are neutrally unpack of the sociology, the military game theory, and the historical precedents he uses.
Right. So to be clear to you listening, we are not endorsing his roadmap, nor are we here to validate or condemn any of these political figures.
Exactly. We're just looking at the engine of his argument to see how the gears turn.
And the core tension driving that engine is this idea that we are fundamentally misdiagnosing the nature of modern conflict.
We're essentially applying 19th and 20th century solutions, building thicker walls, amassing larger armies, clinging to these legacy defense pacts.
Applying all that to 21st century reality.
Right, and those outdated reflexes might actually be the catalyst for the exact global catastrophe we are trying so hard to avoid.
Which brings us to the Middle East, right? Like the most vivid contemporary theater for this kind of strategic misdiagnosis.
Definitely. Debeuf heavily analyzes the rationale behind the periodic pushes for direct U.S. and Israeli military action against Iran.
Which has been around forever.
Oh, yeah. There has been this persistent doctrine circulating through defense and intelligence establishments for over 3 decades now. It relies on a strategy of decapitation.
The whole cut off the snake's head theory.
Exactly. The assumption being that if you eliminate the very top tier of leadership, specifically the supreme leader in this case, the entire national apparatus just shatters.
Right. The idea is the populace rises up, the power vacuum destroys the old guard, and the regime falls in a matter of days.
Yeah, it's a very seductive narrative. You just, use overwhelming force to remove the king piece, and the game is over.
But it's seductive because it works flawlessly against a very specific type of government, right? The mafia state.
Precisely. If you look at Saddam Hussein's Iraq, or Muammar Gaddafi's Libya, or pre-war Syria, you are looking at regimes built entirely on centralized patronage networks.
Where power radiates outward from a singular, charismatic, or just brutal figurehead.
Right. The leader controls the money, the military appointments, the tribal alliances. If you remove the boss and a mafia state, the underlying structural integrity just vanishes.
The underbosses instantly turn on each other to claim the spoils, the patronage dries up, and the whole state architecture crumbles.
Exactly. But treating Iran like a mafia state is just, well, it's a catastrophic category error.
Fundamentally. I mean, Iran is an ideological state.
Right. Its entire societal and governmental architecture is built around a complex theological jurisprudence, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist.
Which is designed deliberately to transcend any single individual.
Yes. And Debeuf's sociological analysis estimates that at least 10% of the Iranian population fervently, genuinely believes in this ideological system.
Now, 10% might sound small if you're just, skimming statistics on a page.
Sure.
But in a nation of nearly 90 million people, 9 million true believers is a massive, deeply entrenched foundation.
It really is. That's enough to fully staff a sprawling bureaucracy, man the regular military, and completely populate an elite internal security apparatus like the Revolutionary Guard.
Because they are fighting for a worldview, right? Not just a paycheck.
Exactly. When an apparatus is built on ideology, a decapitation strike doesn't kill the system. It simply triggers a bureaucratic succession protocol.
Right. If the supreme leader dies, the assembly of experts just convenes and elevates the next qualified jurist.
The machinery is specifically engineered to outlive its operators. So when Western planners pitch a swift, multi-day victory, similar to how the Trump administration allegedly viewed potential interventions, like comparing them to perceived quick wins in places like Venezuela.
Right, treating it like it'll be a walk in the park.
Yeah, they are severely underestimating the resilience of the local sociology.
I like to think of it as the difference between playing chess and fighting a hydra.
Ooh, that's a good analogy.
Right. In chess, the rules say taking the king ends the game immediately, regardless of whatever other pieces are on the board.
Yeah.
But striking an ideological regime is like cutting a head off a hydra. You don't kill the beast. You just trigger a trauma response that creates a more defensive, unified, and aggressive monster.
And that trauma response is actually a well-documented sociological phenomenon. It's known as the rally round the flag effect.
Which we see all the time.
All the time. And the Iranian context provides a textbook example of how foreign military intervention actively rescues an unpopular regime from internal collapse.
Because prior to these hypothetical and actual localized strikes, the Iranian street was boiling.
It really was. We saw massive, sustained protests with citizens openly demanding the dismantling of the theological state. It was an organic, highly dangerous internal threat to the regime.
But the second bombs fall from foreign aircraft. That internal calculus changes instantly. The domestic rebellion just evaporates.
It evaporates because of basic human psychology and survival calculus. When a population faces an existential external threat, internal political fracturing is temporarily suspended.
I mean, you look at the sky, see foreign munitions, and realize two things simultaneously.
Right. First, the regime is about to activate emergency powers and will crack down on internal dissent with absolute impunity under the guise of national security.
Right. And second, marching in the streets against the government while your city is actually under aerial bombardment is basically tantamount to suicide.
Exactly. So the irony is just staggering. You launch the strike hoping the populace will use the chaos to finish off the regime, but the strike itself is the very mechanism that forces the population back into the arms of the state.
It essentially hands the regime a blank check to secure its own continuity.
Yeah. If the supreme leader is elderly and a natural transition of power might have been messy or contested by reformers, the threat of an external war just silences all that.
The ranks close. A successor is elevated without a whisper of dissent, and the system emerges vastly more secure than it was before the bombs even fell.
And, this reliance on the quick war illusion isn't just a military failure. It actively sabotages viable diplomatic off-ramps.
Right.
Debeuf highlights the tragedy of the scrapped 2015 Iran nuclear deal. When the Trump administration unilaterally withdrew from that agreement, it dismantled a functional, monitored freeze on nuclear development.
But the deeper tragedy, according to the sources here, is what happened in the shadows right before subsequent military escalations.
You're talking about the back-channel negotiations in Oman.
Exactly. Tell us about that.
So there was reportedly a new comprehensive agreement sitting right on the table. It involved Omani mediators, U.S. envoys, and high-level figures in the U.S. administration.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. They had quietly negotiated a framework that would achieve the strategic goal preventing a nuclear-armed Iran through actual diplomacy.
But the hammer was chosen over the scalpel.
Yep. The instinct to strike, the allure of that quick, decisive military victory completely overwhelmed the slower, more complex reality of diplomatic statecraft.
The off-ramp was literally sitting on the desk and it was just ignored.
Which brings us to the European reaction, or I should say, the total paralysis of Europe in the face of these events.
Right, because when the U.S. engaged in unilateral actions in the Middle East, actions that lacked broad international legal consensus, Europe remained conspicuously silent.
Crickets. Yet the moment the targeted nation retaliated, European capitals issued swift, unified condemnations of that retaliation.
The double standard is glaring. And it begs the question, right? Why is the European Union, which prides itself on being a bastion of international law and diplomatic norms, so utterly paralyzed when its primary ally acts recklessly?
Well, Debeuf diagnoses this paralysis as a symptom of a deeply toxic dependency. Europe has completely surrendered its strategic autonomy to the NATO alliance.
So you just hand it over.
Right. European leaders can clearly see when an action in the Middle East is legally dubious or strategically disastrous, but they bite their tongues because they are terrified of alienating Washington.
Because they're making a very cold, Very dangerous calculus.
Exactly. Europe relies on the U.S. nuclear umbrella and logistical support to deter Russia, so Europe feels it cannot afford to criticize American adventurism anywhere else in the world.
No matter how destabilizing it is.
Right.
And this is where Debeuf introduces a concept that I think is really going to challenge a lot of people listening. He calls it verlatingsangst.
Right, which is a Dutch term that translates to abandonment anxiety or the fear of being left behind.
He argues that European geopolitical posture isn't based on a confident assertion of its own interests. It's a trauma response.
Yeah.
It's an anxious partner bending over backward, tolerating erratic behavior, just to ensure the protector doesn't pack up and leave.
I mean, you literally see this visually. Think of European leaders like Mark Rutte awkwardly trying to appease the U.S. just to keep the alliance alive.
Looking totally hypocritical to the rest of the world.
Exactly. And that anxiety degrades Europe's standing on the global stage. When leaders from the global south watch European diplomats lecture them on human rights, but then stay completely silent when their primary ally violates those exact norms, Europe's credibility just evaporates.
If you are Vladimir Putin and you want to negotiate an endgame for the war in Ukraine, you don't call Brussels.
No, why would you? You know Brussels has no independent agency. You know the leash is held in Washington. By clinging so desperately to the alliance, Europe has rendered itself diplomatically impotent.
Which leads directly into the most radical proposition of his entire roadmap.
Here we go.
To cure this paralysis, to regain strategic autonomy, and to actually prevent a global conflict, Debeuf argues that Europe must leave NATO.
It is just a breathtaking proposition. To understand why a serious geopolitical analyst would advocate dismantling the most powerful military alliance in human history, we have to look at the historical parallel he draws.
He takes us back to the geopolitical architecture of Europe in the decade leading up to 1914.
Right. Now, I think when most people think of the spark for World War I, they think of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo.
Sure, that's what we learned in school.
But the assassination was just the match. Debeuf is arguing that the alliances themselves were the gasoline, the powder keg, and the fuse all rolled into one.
That is such a crucial distinction.
Yeah.
Because prior to 1914, Europe had constructed this incredibly rigid interlocking system of defense pacts.
Right. You had the Triple Alliance with Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy facing off against the Triple Entente of France, Great Britain, and Russia.
And the entire theoretical justification for these massive alliances was deterrence.
The logic, which sounds incredibly familiar today, was basically no one will dare attack a single member, because doing so guarantees a war with all of us.
It's the precise underlying philosophy of NATO's Article 5. An attack on one is an attack on all. It's supposed to be the ultimate shield.
But the reality of 1914 proved that when a shield is too tightly bound to a complex system, it becomes a tripwire.
Because the assassination of the Balkans was essentially a localized crisis.
Exactly. But because of the alliances, the crisis could not be contained. When Austria-Hungary threatened Serbia, Russia was treaty-bound to mobilize to protect Serbia.
And the moment Russia mobilized, Germany was treaty-bound to mobilize to protect Austria-Hungary.
Right. And once Germany mobilized, France was pulled in, the dominoes just fell.
And what's fascinating here is the mechanics of that mobilization. It wasn't just, political declarations. It was military logistics.
Yeah, the trains.
It's exactly. In 1914, mobilization meant massive railway timetables. Once you ordered millions of men and horses onto the trains toward the border, you couldn't just hit the brakes without throwing your entire defense strategy into total chaos.
The mobilization schedules literally stripped the politicians of their ability to negotiate.
The alliance logistics made the war mathematically unstoppable once the first domino fell.
That is the exact terror of a rigid alliance system. And Debeuf points out that this system was pushed over the edge by the presence of a highly erratic, unpredictable leader at the helm of the most powerful military force.
Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany.
Yes. Wilhelm was notorious for impulsive threats, rapid shifts in policy, and just alienating his own diplomatic corps.
And the comparison Debeuf makes here is impossible to ignore. He essentially frames Donald Trump's leadership style as the modern equivalent of Kaiser Wilhelm II.
It's a bold comparison.
It is. An unpredictable leader at the helm of the alliance's dominant military power, capable of making impulsive unilateral decisions that send shockwaves through the entire system.
Because the overarching warning is that an alliance is only a protective mechanism when every member acts with strict, predictable rationality.
Right.
The moment the strongest member begins acting unilaterally and erratically, the alliance mutates from a shield into a liability. It becomes a toxic alliance.
So let's ground this in a modern, terrifying hypothetical. Let's go back to that localized conflict in the Middle East.
Okay.
The U.S. decides to launch a unilateral strike against Iran. Europe has no say in this and actively advises against it. Iran inevitably retaliates by firing a barrage of ballistic missiles.
Right.
Now, imagine a scenario where some of those retaliatory missiles go off course or are intentionally aimed at U.S. assets, and they strike Turkish soil.
Well, Turkey is a vital member of NATO.
Exactly. And suddenly the Turkish government invokes Article 5. They declare, "We have been subjected to an unprovoked attack by a foreign power. All NATO members are legally obligated to come to our defense."
And just like that, because of a unilateral American action thousands of miles away, European nations who desperately wanted to avoid this exact conflict are suddenly legally and militarily dragged into a massive regional war against Iran.
The tripwire snaps. The dominoes fall exactly as they did in 1914. You are forced to deploy your youth and your economy to fight a war you didn't start over a policy you didn't endorse, simply because the rigid architecture of the alliance demands it.
Which is why Debeuf's argument is that tying your national survival to an unpredictable hegemon is not security. It is the profound strategic vulnerability.
Okay, but I have to push back here. Hard.
Sure for it.
Because I'm imagining you, the listener, screaming at your dashboard right now. The theory makes perfect sense in a vacuum. Autonomy is great. Not getting dragged into foreign wars is great.
Sure.
But we are not in a vacuum. There is a massive, brutal land war happening in Eastern Europe right now.
Yeah.
Russia has explicitly demonstrated a willingness to invade sovereign territory.
Right.
So telling Europe to casually tear up its NATO insurance policy and walk away from the American military umbrella doesn't just sound risky. It sounds like suicidal naivete. I mean, it's like canceling your home insurance right when your neighborhood is getting dangerous.
It's a fair point.
How does Debeuf square the desire for autonomy with the very real, very physical threat of Russian tanks? Is this a realistic path to peace, or just a profoundly dangerous gamble?
It is the ultimate pushback, and it is the exact friction point of modern geopolitics. To address it, Debeuf challenges the very foundation of how we define insurance and deterrence.
Okay.
This moves us into his analysis of the militarism trap. These are his first two insights. Stop rearmament and stop militarism. He argues that our belief that massive armies create safety is actually a cognitive illusion.
A cognitive illusion.
Yeah, an ancient evolutionary reflex that actively backfires in the modern era.
The intuition trap.
Then?
I want to unpack the evolutionary biology of this because it's fascinating.
Please do.
For 99% of human history, our survival depended on a very simple algorithm. If a rival tribe appears over the hill, you build a higher wall. You sharpen more spears. You train more warriors.
Right.
The physical accumulation of defensive violence was the objectively correct strategy for surviving the Middle Ages. It is hardwired into our fight-or-flight response.
Exactly. But evolutionary biology, specifically the concept of the Red Queen hypothesis, shows us the limits of this.
Right, the Red Queen from Alice in Wonderland.
Exactly. In biology, the Red Queen hypothesis states that a species must constantly adapt, evolve, and proliferate, not to gain a dominant advantage, but simply to survive against opposing organisms that are evolving at the exact same rate.
You are running as fast as you can just to stay in the exact same place.
Yep. In game theory and international relations, they call it the security dilemma. I buy a tank to feel safe. You see my tank, feel threatened, and buy 2 tanks.
I see your 2 tanks, completely panic, and buy 3.
Exactly. We both think we are acting defensively, but we are actually caught in a recursive loop of escalation.
And Debeuf argues that Europe is currently trapped in the most dangerous manifestation of this dilemma.
They absolutely are. There is a massive political push right now for European nations to drastically increase defense spending, aiming for 5% of their GDP.
5% is massive.
It is. Politicians are talking about a war economy, building vast bunker networks, recruiting hundreds of thousands of new personnel.
But the data Debeuf presents completely undercuts the narrative driving this panic. We are constantly sold this story that Europe has disarmed itself into a state of pathetic weakness, right? That we are sitting ducks waiting for the Russian juggernaut.
Right, that's the narrative.
But look at the actual numbers in the source. If you combine the conventional armed forces of the European nations, excluding the United States entirely, Europe currently commands roughly 3.3 million soldiers.
3.3 million.
Yes. And Russia's active personnel is around 1.3 million.
Wow. So even factoring in the complexities of readiness and integration, Europe is not numerically outgunned in a conventional sense.
Not at all.
The industrial capacity, the number of advanced aircraft, the economic base, it vastly dwarfs the Russian Federation. So the push for hypermilitarization isn't actually about reaching parity, it's a psychological shift.
And that psychological shift is the true danger. When a society transitions to a war footing, when it starts slashing budgets for education, infrastructure, and diplomacy to feed the military-industrial complex, it enters a state of cognitive tunnel vision.
Exactly. The populace begins to internalize the narrative that war is not merely a risk to be managed, but an inevitability.
And once leadership and the public believe war is inevitable, their behavior changes drastically.
They stop looking for diplomatic off-ramps, they become highly reactive. And the historical data here is a massive red flag.
What does the data show?
Debeuf notes that in the single decade preceding World War I, total European defense spending rose by 50%. Every empire believed they were arming for peace, for deterrence, but that massive accumulation of kinetic energy demanded release.
Wow, 50%.
Contrast that with today. In just the last 5 years, global defense spending has surged by 62%.
62%.
Jesus. We are sprinting toward the precipice significantly faster than the empires of 1914 did. Massive militaries don't deter war, they make war feel inevitable.
But the counter-argument you always hear to this is the Cold War, right? People point to the 40-year standoff between the U.S. and the Soviets and say, look, mutually assured destruction worked. The arms race kept the peace because everyone was too terrified to pull the trigger.
Debeuf attacks that myth directly. He argues that the Cold War didn't produce peace, it produced an era of unprecedented, continuous existential peril that we only survived through sheer blind luck.
Blind luck.
Seriously, he points to Dwight D. Eisenhower. Here is the supreme Allied commander who defeated Nazi Germany, a military man to his core.
Right.
As U.S. president in the 1950s, he oversaw the massive expansion of the American nuclear arsenal. But by the time he left office, his perspective had radically shifted.
His famous farewell address.
Exactly. His warning against the military-industrial complex was the realization of a man who saw that infinite rearmament was making the homeland infinitely less secure.
And the ultimate, terrifying proof that deterrence is a gamble, not a strategy, is the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962.
Oh, absolutely.
We all know the broad strokes, Kennedy and Khrushchev staring each other down. But the granular mechanics of how close we actually came to annihilation destroy the illusion that rational actors can manage an arms race safely.
Let's look at the anecdote he shares about the B-59 submarine incident. This is chilling.
Set the scene for us.
At the height of the crisis, a Soviet diesel-electric submarine, the B-59, was operating deep underwater near the American blockade line off the coast of Cuba.
Okay.
American destroyers began dropping practice depth charges, essentially small explosives designed to signal the submarine to surface.
But the crew of the B-59 didn't know they were practice charges.
No, they had no idea. They are sitting in a metal tube deep underwater. The air conditioning has failed. The temperature inside the sub is pushing 120 degrees Fahrenheit.
That sounds like a nightmare.
It was. Men are literally passing out from carbon dioxide poisoning. They have been cut off from communication with Moscow for days, and suddenly the hull is being rocked by explosions.
So the captain of the submarine, Valentin Savitsky, understandably concluded that World War III had already broken out on the surface.
He believed his vessel was under lethal attack. Now, the B-59 was armed with a nuclear torpedo, possessing roughly the explosive yield of the Hiroshima bomb.
Wow.
Under Soviet standard operating procedures for that specific deployment, the captain had the authority to launch the nuclear weapon, provided he had the unanimous consent of the other two senior officers on board.
The political officer, Ivan Maslenikov, and the flotilla commodore, Vasily Arkhipov.
Yes. 3 men in a sweltering dark tube thinking the world is ending. The captain, Savitsky, votes to launch.
And the political officer, Maslenikov, agrees.
They are ready to fire a nuclear weapon at the American fleet, an act that would have guaranteed an immediate, full-scale nuclear retaliation against the Soviet Union, ending human civilization as we know it.
It literally came down to one man.
Vasily Arkhipov, the Commodore. He refused to give his consent. He argued that the American depth charges were signals, not attacks, and insisted they surface to await orders from Moscow. He held his ground against the captain's fury.
One guy having a level-headed moment in a 120-degree submarine is the only reason you and I are sitting here having this conversation today.
It's terrifying when you think about it.
It is, The systemic deterrence completely failed, the safeguards failed, the logic failed. The entire architecture of the Cold War arms race culminated in a situation where the survival of the human species rested on the stress response of a single, exhausted Russian naval officer.
Which is Debeuf's point, exactly. When you stockpile world-ending weapons and massively expand your conventional forces, you are not buying security.
Right.
You are buying a lottery ticket where the jackpot is the apocalypse, and you are just praying every single day that your numbers don't come up. The physical reality of the weapons creates the conditions for their use.
It's like two neighbors constantly buying bigger guard dogs and higher fences. Eventually, a dog is going to jump the fence.
That's a great way to put it.
But here is the truly insidious part of this dynamic. The militarism trap, this ancient reflex to build walls and hoard weapons, isn't just happening with tanks and troops anymore. It has migrated.
Right.
The most aggressive arms race happening right now is entirely invisible. It's happening in our minds, on our smartphones.
This brings us to Insight 3. Stop the algorithms of war. If physical militarization prepares the state for conflict, algorithmic militarization prepares the mind.
Which is just as dangerous.
Arguably more so. Debeuf takes a rigorous look at how the architecture of modern social media platforms like X, Facebook, and TikTok is actively dismantling the sociological foundations required for peace.
We really need to explain the mechanics of this, because it's not just that people are being mean to each other on the internet. It is a highly engineered neurobiological hack.
It is. These algorithms are designed with a singular, ruthless objective: maximize user time on the platform to maximize ad revenue.
Right. And the tech companies learned very early on that the most efficient way to capture human attention is to hijack the amygdala.
The part of the brain responsible for processing fear, outrage, and threat detection.
Exactly. It is the digital equivalent of the Red Queen hypothesis we just discussed. To keep you engaged, the algorithm must constantly feed you slightly more stimulating, slightly more extreme content than you saw yesterday.
If you lean left, it feeds you content confirming your worst fears about the right. If you lean right, it serves up highly curated videos showing the left destroying society.
It creates a dopamine feedback loop of righteous indignation. You are fed exactly what confirms your biases, and you are shown the most unhinged, radical caricatures of anyone who disagrees with you.
And the algorithm systematically starves the nuanced, moderate middle ground of visibility, because nuance doesn't generate clicks, outrage does.
Outrage is the currency. And Debeuf connects this algorithmic architecture to a broader sociological phenomenon he calls tribalization.
Yeah, to understand why the human brain is so susceptible to this algorithmic hijacking, you have to look at the macro environment.
World we live in today.
Exactly. The modern citizen is drowning in cognitive overload. We are living through an era of staggering, accelerating complexity. Globalization has scrambled local economies. Technology is rendering entire career paths obsolete overnight.
Traditional hierarchies, gender norms, and religious anchors are shifting rapidly. It is exhausting.
It is. The world used to feel decipherable. During the Cold War, despite the existential dread, the narrative was incredibly simple. It was a bipolar world: U.S. versus Soviet Union, capitalism versus communism, good versus evil.
It was binary.
But today, everything is a multifaceted, interconnected, chaotic gray area.
And when the human brain is overwhelmed by sustained uncertainty and complexity, its defense mechanism is to regress. We retreat into tribes.
We desperately seek out simple, binary narratives to organize the chaos. We begin to crave strong, authoritarian figures who promise to cut through the nuance and restore order.
And most dangerously, we romanticize a mythic past. An us versus them mentality.
Now, the analysis makes a profoundly chilling comparison here. It argues that modern algorithmic tribalization is a more potent, efficient, and pervasive weapon than the state propaganda apparatus of the 1930s.
Wait, like more efficient than Joseph Goebbels and the Nazi Ministry of Propaganda?
Yes. And it sounds hyperbolic until you break down the delivery mechanism. In the 1930s, propaganda was geographically and temporally bound. You had to physically attend a Nuremberg rally. You had to sit in a cinema to watch a state-sanctioned film.
You read a specific newspaper in the morning. The propaganda was intense, but it had boundaries. You eventually turned off the radio and went to sleep.
But the algorithm has no boundaries. It is an intimate, 247 intravenous drip directly into your central nervous system. It travels in your pocket.
You check it the moment you wake up and the moment before you sleep.
And the terrifying part is that it isn't just a blind machine seeking profit anymore. It has been weaponized by state actors with explicit geopolitical objectives.
Right. Debeuf points to a striking ideological alignment between seemingly disparate forces.
Hmm.
He links Vladimir Putin's Russia, certain elements of the Medjay movement in the U.S., and the surging far-right nationalist parties across Europe.
Again, framing this strictly through Debeuf's sociological lens, he argues that these movements share a foundational anti-Enlightenment philosophy.
The Enlightenment being the 18th century movement that gave us the concepts of universal human rights, secularism, the scientific method, and democratic pluralism.
Exactly. These movements are rejecting that legacy. Debeuf cites Alexander Dugin, the prominent Russian political philosopher whose theories have heavily influenced the Kremlin.
What does Dugin say?
Dugin explicitly argues that the Enlightenment was a historical disaster. He views individualism, cosmopolitanism, and universal reason as spiritual diseases that destroy national identity.
Wow.
The goal of this ideology is to shatter the liberal democratic consensus and return to a world defined by rigid, traditional, often ethnocentric hierarchies.
A world where everyone knows their place, enforced by strength. And these actors don't need to drop bombs to achieve this. They use the engagement algorithms of Western tech companies to do the heavy lifting for them.
There is a specific, devastating case study detailed in the analysis that illustrates perfectly how this hybrid warfare operates in the real world.
The Lisa case in Germany.
Yes, the Lisa case.
Mhm.
It heavily involved the Russian-speaking immigrant community.
Break down the mechanics of what happened here, because
Right.
it perfectly shows how a cognitive arms race works.
So a rumor began circulating on obscure message boards and Telegram channels that a young girl named Lisa from the Russian-German community had been kidnapped, held for hours, and brutally assaulted by a group of migrants.
Specifically pointing the finger at Syrian or Afghan refugees. Now, at this time, immigration was already the most volatile, emotionally charged issue in German politics.
Exactly. It was the perfect wedge issue. The story was picked up and systematically amplified by a coordinated network of algorithmic bots.
They just spammed it everywhere.
Yep. It was pushed onto mainstream platforms like Facebook and Twitter, utilizing thousands of fake accounts to game the trending algorithms. Then, Russian state media, specifically RT and Sputnik, picked up the algorithmic momentum and broadcast the story as verified news.
The result was explosive. It leaped from the digital world into the physical world instantly.
Tens of thousands of people took to the streets in massive, highly organized anti-migrant protests across Germany. The outrage dominated the national conversation for weeks.
And it had real political consequences.
Oh, massive consequences. It created intense pressure on the political center and resulted in a significant, measurable surge in polling numbers for the AfD, Germany's far-right nationalist party.
And the most crucial fact of this entire event, the thing that just blows my mind, is that the story was a complete 100% fabrication.
Never happened.
The girl herself eventually admitted to police that she had made the entire thing up to hide the fact that she had stayed out all night. There were no refugees. There was no assault.
But the truth simply didn't matter. The Russian intelligence apparatus recognized that a united, cohesive Europe is a strategic threat.
Right.
And they realize that the most cost-effective way to neutralize that threat is to use the algorithm to induce autoimmune disease within the European body politic. You pull the population to the extreme xenophobic right and the extreme reactive left, entirely hollowing out the moderate center where democratic governance actually happens.
You paralyze the nation using its own technology. It is incredibly bleak.
It really is.
It proves that a bot network can literally fracture a society based on a total fiction, purely by exploiting the evolutionary vulnerabilities of our brains. Which leads me to the most urgent question of this deep dive.
What is it?
If the algorithms are explicitly designed to divide us, and human nature craves this tribal simplicity when we are stressed, are we entirely at the mercy of our tech? How do you fight an enemy that lives inside your own newsfeed and uses your own dopamine to manipulate you? Fact-checking clearly doesn't work. By the time you publish a debunking article, the lie has already circled the globe.
Fact-checking is necessary, but as a strategic defense, it is entirely insufficient.
Why?
Because fact-checking is an appeal to reason, but tribalization is an emotional process. Pointing out that the tribe's foundational myth is factually incorrect doesn't weaken the tribe. It often strengthens their cohesion as they feel under attack by elitist outsiders.
Right. It just hardens their resolve.
Debeuf argues that you cannot defeat a powerful, simple, emotional narrative with a spreadsheet of facts. You can only defeat it with a stronger, more compelling, positive counter-narrative.
Which brings us to his final insights, focusing on how leaders can actually change the game. Insight 5. the power of counter-narratives and the architecture of a new world order.
Debeuf points out a chronic, fatal flaw in how moderate politicians attempt to combat the rise of tribal nationalism. They almost always resort to offering fascism light.
We see this constantly. A center-right or center-left politician looks at the polling, sees a far-right party gaining 15% of the vote by demonizing immigrants, and the moderate panics.
Yeah, and instead of defending the liberal order, the moderate adopts a slightly watered-down version of the far right's talking points. They think, if I talk a little bit tougher on borders, I can win those waiters back.
But it fails every single time.
Every time. It fails because you cannot beat an authentic, passionate narrative with a cynical, diluted echo of that same narrative. When the moderate adopts the far-right framing, they don't win back voters. They simply legitimize the far-right's underlying premise.
They shift the entire Overton window toward the extreme. To break the algorithm of tribalization, you need a completely different positive narrative.
And the analysis uses a profoundly controversial historical moment to demonstrate what a successful counter-narrative actually looks like in practice. It looks at German Chancellor Angela Merkel's handling of the 2015 refugee crisis.
Okay, this is a fascinating reinterpretation of recent history, because in 2015, over 1 million refugees, largely fleeing the Syrian civil war, were marching across the Balkans toward Western Europe. The overwhelming political instinct across the continent was to panic, to militarize the borders, to build razor-wire fences, and to declare a state of siege. The instinct was to fall right back into the intuition trap, build a higher wall.
But Merkel went against the gravitational pull of the entire continent. She stood in front of the cameras and delivered 3 words. Wir schaffen das. We can manage this.
She declared that Germany would not close its borders, that it would absorb and integrate the refugees.
Now, let's be clear, this policy is still fiercely debated. Many analysts point to that exact phrase as the accelerant that supercharged the rise of the AfD in Germany and fueled Brexit in the UK.
It was incredibly disruptive.
But Debeuf, who was living and working as a diplomat in the Middle East during this exact period, offers a completely different strategic perspective on what that phrase actually achieved on a global scale.
He argues that Wir schaffen das was a tactical masterstroke that delivered a fatal blow to the most dangerous ideological narrative of that decade, the narrative of ISIS. But break that down for me. How does opening a border in Bavaria hurt a terrorist group in Raqqa?
In 2015, ISIS was operating the most sophisticated, high production value radicalization campaign in history. They were broadcasting globally, targeting marginalized Muslims in the West and across the Middle East.
Right, we all remember those videos.
Their core narrative, the absolute foundation of their recruitment, was a binary clash of civilizations. They preached, the West inherently despises you. Europe hates Islam. They want to bomb your cities and destroy your religion. Your only option for survival is to abandon the West and join our brutal caliphate to fight them.
It was a narrative perfectly designed to exploit the alienation and geopolitical chaos of the region.
Exactly. And the moment European nations started talking about banning Muslims and building walls, they were inadvertently providing B-roll footage for ISIS propaganda videos. They were confirming the narrative.
But then the leader of the most powerful economic engine in Europe stood up and said, "You are welcome here. We will give you sanctuary."
It completely shattered the premise. The text notes that the gravitational pull of ISIS's radicalization machine essentially collapsed in the immediate aftermath of that statement, because the logic of the extremist narrative could not survive the reality of Merkel's actions.
I mean, you simply cannot convince a Syrian teenager that the West is dedicated to the total annihilation of his people when the most prominent Western leader is sending trains to pick them up and offering them housing and education.
She didn't try to argue with ISIS on theological grounds. She didn't drop a bomb to silence them. She executed a geopolitical counter-narrative. She changed the objective reality of the story, and by doing so, she neutralized the ideological threat far more effectively than a drone strike ever could.
And this brings us to the absolute crescendo of Debeuf's thesis. He argues that we need to apply the logic of Wir schaffen das, this bravery to embrace complexity and build inclusive structures rather than walls, to the entire global architecture.
Because right now, the global architecture is fundamentally broken.
This is Insight 5, the necessity of building a new world order. Debeuf argues that the current geopolitical instability is the direct result of Western hubris following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991.
Ah, the end of history era. Francis Fukuyama's famous thesis. There was this overwhelming, intoxicating arrogance in Washington and London in the 90s.
The belief was that the ideological debate of human existence was permanently settled. Western liberal democracy and free market capitalism had won, and it was only a matter of time before the rest of the globe simply copy-pasted our institutions.
And because of that hubris, the West felt no need to build a new, inclusive framework for global peace. We just kept running the legacy systems. And the most glaring example of this systemic fossilization is the United Nations Security Council.
It is almost absurd when you really look at it. The Security Council, the ultimate arbiter of international law and military intervention, is controlled by 5 permanent members with veto power: the U.S., the U.K., France, Russia, and China.
That structure was locked in place in 1945. It is literally just a snapshot of the victors of World War II.
It is an 80-year-old relic that completely ignores the economic and demographic reality of the 21st century. You have massive, highly influential global powers today. India, with over 1 billion people, Brazil, the anchor of South America, a vastly more powerful China, South Africa.
And they look at the UN and see a system explicitly designed to maintain Western hegemony.
And Debeuf's point is that you cannot maintain long-term global stability if the vast majority of the world's population feels permanently locked out of the boardroom where the rules of the game are written.
If the global South and the rising powers feel the system is rigged, they won't defend the system when it's under attack. They will look for ways to subvert it, or they will simply build their own competing systems, like we are seeing with the expansion of the BRICS economic bloc.
Which is exactly how Debeuf ties this entire massive geopolitical theory together. This is why the first step, Europe leaving NATO, is the indispensable prerequisite for everything else.
Yeah, walk us through that final connection. How does breaking the Atlantic Alliance lead to a new UN?
Well, if Europe remains tethered to the United States via NATO, it remains a subordinate player in the old 20th century hegemony. It is just an extension of Washington's will.
Right.
But if Europe takes the terrifying leap to sever that tie and achieve true strategic autonomy, it changes the entire geometry of global power. Suddenly, Europe isn't just America's junior partner. It becomes an independent, incredibly wealthy, diplomatically potent pole in a multipolar world.
And with that autonomy, Europe can become the architect of a new chessboard. Right now, if Brussels tries to negotiate a new security architecture with Moscow or Beijing, they are laughed out of the room because everyone knows the U.S. holds the veto.
But an independent Europe could go to Russia, to China, to India, to Brazil and say, the 1945 system is dead, the American unipolar moment is over. Let's sit down as equals and draft a new global security framework that actually reflects the modern world.
It is a staggering vision. It requires an alliance of nations committed strictly to international law and multipolar cooperation, actively standing between the brute force of the remaining superpowers.
It is somewhat akin to the non-aligned movement during the Cold War. Countries like India, Yugoslavia, and Egypt striving to exist outside the binary of the U.S. and the Soviets, but with the economic engine of the European Union driving it.
It requires an unbelievable amount of diplomatic bravery. We are talking about dismantling the Bretton Woods legacy, risking intense economic retaliation from the United States, and trusting that an independent Europe can deter Russian aggression through economic entanglement and new security pacts, rather than American nuclear weapons.
It is the ultimate test of whether international law and diplomatic statecraft can actually govern human affairs, or if we're just biologically destined to return to the law of the jungle,
where the strong do what they want and the weak suffer what they must. Debeuf isn't offering a utopian guarantee. He readily admits his roadmap is fraught with peril.
But his core argument is that continuing on our current trajectory, building infinite weapons, clinging to toxic, rigid alliances, and allowing algorithmic warfare to rot our domestic cohesion is not a strategy. It is a guaranteed countdown to failure.
The analogy that comes to mind is that we are all trapped playing a deeply complex board game, and the rules of this game were written 80 years ago by one dominant player.
Right.
Now, a dozen new, powerful players have pulled up chairs to the table. The board is practically catching fire. The pieces don't move the way they used to, but the original player absolutely refuses to update the rulebook.
Eventually, the tension will snap. If you don't collaboratively rewrite the rules to include everyone at the table, the disenfranchised players aren't just going to lose quietly. They're going to flip the board in frustration.
And flipping the board, in the context of 21st century geopolitics, means thermonuclear war.
That is the exact dynamic. We have to possess the courage to draft a new rulebook before the board is flipped.
So we've covered an immense amount of ground today. We've gone from the intricacies of Iranian theology to the depths of a suffocating Soviet submarine and into the dark code of our smartphones. Let's synthesize this for you, the listener. How does absorbing Debeuf's radical roadmap change how you interact with the world tomorrow morning?
It provides a completely new filter for processing the barrage of information we face daily. The next time your phone buzzes with a news alert about a massive new defense spending bill, or the deployment of tripwire forces to Eastern Europe, or a fiery, polarizing political controversy engineered to make your blood boil, I want you to pause.
Look at it through the lens of Debeuf's 5 insights. Ask yourself, are the politicians and algorithms driving this narrative trying to win a 20th century war using the ancient reflex of walls and weapons?
Or are they doing the much harder, braver work of trying to prevent a 21st century conflict through complex diplomacy and counter-narratives, because the strategies required for those two goals are diametrically opposed?
To recap the architecture of peace we've discussed, we have to consciously reject our deepest biological intuition to hoard weapons the moment we feel scared. We have to recognize that relying on outdated, rigid military alliances can mutate into a toxic trap that drags us into the very wars they were designed to prevent.
We must aggressively break the polarizing neurobiological trance of social media algorithms. And ultimately, we have to step into the terrifying unknown, abandoning the comfort of the American umbrella to build a new, inclusive, multipolar world order.
It requires a massive cognitive leap for our species. It demands that we abandon the strategies that feel safe and intuitive in favor of the complex diplomatic systems that are actually necessary for survival in an interconnected era.
Which brings us right back to the precipice where we started this conversation, that vertigo of stepping out of the fortress and leaving your weapons behind. I want to leave you, the listener, with one final lingering question to mull over on your own.
If our oldest, most hardwired evolutionary reflex is to arm ourselves and build an impenetrable wall the very second we detect a threat,
But our modern nuclear-armed survival requires us to do the exact opposite, to dismantle our alliances, drop our weapons, and invite our rivals to the table. Is human nature actually capable of evolving fast enough to prevent our own destruction?
it is the defining question of our time.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.